Yes, the power.
Yeah, they did really fast. It was an extreme pressing. It was. Yeah, they were really in safe position. And they fell apart. Yeah, it's, I don't think they're meant but they'd have to win multiple wonder.
The other one gets followed by
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Come back to Minnesota Twins, the baseball postseason.
No, not in our.
Oh, that is
doing fine.
No,
I was referring that they've been drafted by the White Sox.
No, his
No, and that would
not
be
that
great. They've been drafted away, but that would be great.
I think we should try out. I could live in Europe. You know, one year Ed Wall, Hall of Fame, baseball, one of the greatest footballers.
Yeah, the thing is, these are still incredible players. I mean, they're extraordinary. You know, they're freaks of humanity. And yet, that's not, you know, it's like everybody's that much better.
37
36. Part of it is that they're you know, so and months ago when I originally learned about this, that was great. You know, it's not like classic standard. I know this better, well, otherwise, so and then it got the various this year's one this year, these are great. But there is just
I'll try my best. Good evening, everybody. I was just telling Cammy that sometimes in class, when I can't get people's attention, I stand on the desk, and then there's silence. Oh, thank you for making it so I didn't have to stand on the desk tonight. I appreciate that a lot. So before I forget, people who are in my classes, there are sign-in sheets on both sides. So if you haven't signed in yet, if you could sign in on your way out the door, that'd be great. So I am so glad that you're here tonight. And welcome to our friends who are in live stream land. I mean, I'm glad you're here tonight too. First things first, if you could turn off your phones and so they're not one little bit of temptation, I would really appreciate it. Thank you, thank you. So I'm Ann Mayberry in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, and I am delighted that Dr. Camilla Townsend is here as part of our National Endowment for the Humanities grant that I received along with Valerie Deisinger in history, and Bob Halshu-Simmons in classics, and David Wright in English. I'm glad to see so many students here. As you know, one truly wonderful thing about college is making friends you'll have for life. So I'm doubly delighted to welcome Dr. Townsend, since Camilla and I met when we were 17 years old at the start of our college days. And I'm not going to say how long ago that was, but here we are.
All of your professors really were 17?
And that's a kata. So I'm lucky to have Cami for a lifelong friend, and also to be able to welcome her here to our wonderful Monmouth College world. A women's studies major in college, Dr. Townsend earned her PhD in history from Rutgers University, where she is now Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of History. She's the author of many books on Native American history, including with Nikki K. Michael, On the Turtle's Back, Stories the Lenape told their grandchildren. Dr. Townsend is a research fellow at the Kluge Center of the Library of Congress, did I pronounce that right? Okay. In Washington, D.C. this year, and she's received many awards, including the Kundal Prize in History. Dr. Townsend's talk this evening is Water Snakes, Bears, and Wild Pecans, how the Delaware Indians packed their stories and took them with them every time they moved. Please join me in giving Camilla Townsend a warm Monmouth College welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne and Professor Mayberry, and thank all of you. I thank all of you for coming. I perhaps shouldn't mention this, but I have known Anne so long that I remember the days when she was, in fact, your age and used to like to gallop around the dorms and even the quad outside, pretending to be a knight on a horse, like in Monty Python. If you are too young to have seen the Monty Python shows, you have to go see them. Okay, great. Okay, great. I've been having a wonderful day here. Already we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. Okay. I've been having a fantastic day here at Monmouth. The weather has been perfect. The students and classes were wonderful. The colleagues that I have met have been kind and smart and interesting. It really is a delight, and I've heard wonderful stories about the place, okay, as it is today, or has been for the last 20-some years. Okay. But now for a little while, I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back to this area and the wider Ohio Valley area 200 years ago. I will begin as I would begin if I were here with my the book's co-author, Nikki K. Michael, who is in fact a Lenape or Delaware Indian. Nulele tamuhena dieli payek. It means we are very glad that you have come here tonight. What we would say in English would be welcome. Okay? She always begins her talks by thanking people for being interested in her history, and I thank you too, although it is in fact also your history in that you are of this place. Okay? So the Lenape, or the Delaware, did not originate here. Most of you probably know this, but in case not, I like to begin at the beginning so we make sure everyone's on the same page, so to speak. Okay? The Lenape originated in the New York City area. Okay? I live now in New Jersey, so there's a reason that I'm studying the Lenape Indians. They lived also on Long Island and up the Hudson River and into Pennsylvania and down even into Delaware and Maryland. There were various dialects within the Lenape language. So you may have heard of Muncie Lenape or Unami Lenape, but all of these dialects were mutually comprehensible. So we really are talking about a unified culture. Now, sadly, and I think this too is probably familiar to everybody, but again, want to make sure, okay, the Lenape were not welcome to stay. Okay? Once the Dutch and the English came in great numbers, they were gradually pressed to move. Okay? They were not forced out at gunpoint. Okay? It was a subtle process. I think you are familiar with it. Through the loss of their hunting lands, through voluntary purchase, through violent incidents, they gradually made the decision to leave. A few individuals stayed, and to this day, there are people in New Jersey who say, hey, I'm Lenape, I've looked it up, or I've done Ancestry.com, and I know that I've got one great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother who's a Lenape. But I'm talking about people who chose to leave together, who chose to hang together as a tribe, keep electing chiefs, keep their language alive, keep their culture alive. And they lived side by side with the Dutch. The Dutch kind of let them be. A little fighting in Staten Island, but mostly the Dutch let them be. When the English entered the New Amsterdam's harbor in the 1660s and set up shop there and changed the name of the town to New York, and most of the Dutch people decided, oh, we don't want to come, fall under this cultural sway of the English. We want to speak our language and worship God the way we want to. So they poured into New Jersey. And at that point, it was too much Dutch for many of the Lenape. So that the side-by-side, let's all be neighbors thing kind of fell by the wayside, and they began to move. And then, of course, when more English-speaking settlers followed, they really began to move. And they ended up living along the Delaware River, and that's why they were called by the settlers the Delaware. So you will hear me speaking interchangeably of the Lenape, which is their name for themselves, or the Delaware, which is still their name. At the end of all their various moves, they speak of themselves as the Lenape when they're among themselves, but their official name is the Delaware Tribe of Indian in Oklahoma. So around the time of the Revolution, most of them were living in western Pennsylvania, a few already in Ohio. Then after the American Revolution, I think, again, most of you know this, given that you're from this place, in 1795 in the eastern side of the Ohio Valley, they signed the Treaty of Greenville, and in that treaty, the Delaware, like several other tribes, agreed to give up all their lands in this part of the world and move further west in the Ohio Valley, ending up in Indiana and Illinois. And in that period, they were still trying to live as they always had. They were still trying to be part-time farmers, part-time hunters. They were still speaking their language. They had relatively little contact even with the settlers because, and here again, I speak of something that I think many of you know, but just in case not, during the revolution at Gnadenhutten, some very anti-Indian vigilantes had attacked a community of Lenape or Delaware people and killed them down to the last child. So by the time in the 1820s when the Lenape were living in Indiana and Illinois, they were kind of down on the missionaries because they felt these people had brought us together, tried to talk us into this thing called Christianity, and then disappeared when the vigilantes came to kill the whole town. Right? So they did their best to keep their culture alive, but of course, as you know, more and more settlers were pouring into Indiana and Illinois in the 18-teens, 20s, and 30s. And in 1820, they did agree to cross the Mississippi near Kaskaskia, Illinois. They collected from the various towns in Indiana and Illinois where they had been living and crossed together because they wanted to keep their tribe together. Their time in Missouri was rather disastrous. The Osage Indians were living there and were not very happy to have to share the land with them, and there was some skirmishing, and even the son of the chief, of the Lenape chief, was killed. There were many deaths. It was not good land for farming or hunting. So this time, when the federal government began to press them to move again, this time they actually were quite willing to, because they had had such a horrible time in Missouri. They went to Kansas. But there they end up in Kansas during the time of the Civil War. And you all know about bleeding Kansas, right? The Kansas settlers were fighting each other. Are we Confederates or are we Northerners, et cetera? And the Indians were pulled in every which way. And then the railroads, by the end of the Civil War, the railroads were showing up. So they were begged and then pressured to sell the land in Kansas and go to Indian Territory or Oklahoma. That happened by the late 1860s. And then they were still sitting there when Oklahoma became a state. Right? So between the American Revolution, so 1790s, and the end of the period after the American Revolution, the 1790s, and the very early 1900s, so let us say throughout the entire 1800s, pretty much every 20 years, they were packing up literally and moving on. It's very hard, as you can imagine, to maintain family connections, personal sort of psychic stability, and certainly your culture when you're constantly moving. And yet, I'm going to argue, they did manage to do that. They did manage to, so to speak, pack their culture. Okay? Now, this project was something really new for me. I was just telling colleagues at dinner, what I really am, sort of most of the time, you're going to laugh, you're going to think, is an Aztec scholar. I study Nahuatl language sources. The Native Americans who lived in Mexico, and some of them actually in the Southwest, they wrote a great deal in their own language. When the friars taught them the Roman alphabet, our alphabet, they were like, oh, I like this concept. They had pictoglyphic writing, but they were already forgetting how to read it. We have them commenting on that at the time. After the conquest, people forget their old glyphic writing. So they quickly saw this phonetic transcription system thing. That is news you can use. Because you only have to learn the 26 letters and you can represent any sound you want in your own language. So they wrote and wrote and wrote. Eventually, of course, those Nahuatl or Aztec Indians became very Christian and very influenced by the Spanish Empire. But for the first 20 to 60 years that they were writing, they were writing about their own traditions. The young, mostly boys, I'm not being sexist, just realistic, who had learned the alphabet, went home and said to grandma or grandpa, tell me the history, tell me the prayer, tell me what you used to say. So, like if you look at this, there's some Spanish words mixed in. Like here, some of you may see viernes, okay? But other than that, other than a few Spanish words for days, etc., if you look at this, it's not Spanish. Opu, inik, ilwitzin, quizá, that's not Spanish, right? Those of you who remember your high school Spanish. So I was spoiled as a scholar. I studied Native American history, and I've got all these writings written by Native Americans in their own language about things that they were interested in. Some of them also worked with friars about things and wrote about things that the friars were interested in. But a lot of them were doing this at home, talking to grandpa and grandma, etc. So this is the kind of stuff I want to find and I want to have when I'm studying Native American history. But in the case of Lenape and most of the people who came through the Ohio Valley, I'm out of luck, right? That is just not something we're going to find. So when I first began to do this project, I got interested because of where I live. I'm living in New Jersey. I'm living, in the Lenape homeland, and I wanted to find something like this. And I was frustrated to think that we wouldn't be able to do Lenape history in the same way or the same level of depth and richness that we have other kinds of Native American history where there is writing. I'm going to have trouble every time. There we go. Okay. All we've really got, as you know, again, this is true for the majority of North American indigenous peoples, but certainly for the Lenape, are archaeological remains. Oh dear, I did this in a different, sorry folks, I did this in a different program and look what happened. Let's hope that doesn't happen throughout. Goodness. Don't do like this, undergraduate students. Don't do it like that. Don't do as I do. So we have only the archaeological remains and European texts, no writings of their own. And sometimes, of course, it can work out, but often it doesn't. You probably have local exhibits like this too. You can go into almost any library in New Jersey or local museums or mom and pop museums and see bluntly very dull exhibits, right? Old glass vitrines with a row of axe heads and arrows, and you're told, these are the people who used to live there. And I think you can trust me on this, given that I'm spending my whole life studying, my professional life studying native languages and teaching native history. I do care, but even I look at this and think sort of ho-hum. And I watch the grade school kids being toured through here, and you can barely get them to even look at the axe heads, right? So I'm thinking, yes, we can write about this. We can say, oh, this axe head looks different than the others because they traded with villages, down the Delaware River. But it doesn't get inside their heads. It doesn't tell us what they're thinking, what they're feeling, as we can when we have their writings. Okay. Now, there are exceptions. If there's an archaeologist in the room, one of you would have said this, and so I'll quick say it. There are some extraordinary findings that come out of archaeological sites that just convey very quickly passion, interest. I mean, we can't know what the maker of this object was thinking. We know there's a rattle that was used in religious ceremonies. There's mother of pearl decorations up there on the top of the head. So you're suddenly reminded these people had art, these people had interesting conversations, But we still can't hear the conversations, because you find this, but you don't find that, a transcript of the text that goes with it. Okay? So even when my archaeologist friend said, oh no, there are some fantastic things that can teach us about Lenape culture, I was still frustrated, right? Because I couldn't hear anything. Now, the European texts, and those of you in the room who are history majors who have even taken a history class have probably been put through this exercise already, but the problem with the European sources is that they're, of course, all from the European point of view, and we spend all our time trying to read between the lines or guess what they might have been implying about something or other. There's a set of printed brochures, the right word in that they were presented to advertise a school, but they're more than brochures. They're full of stories and information about a certain boarding school that was founded in the colonial era, the first native boarding school, by this Presbyterian Eleazar, yes, he was Presbyterian. That's something, I think Monmouth, were you not founded by Presbyterians too? Right, and he was. I suddenly thought I'm telling you a falsehood, but no, he was, okay. By a Presbyterian, Eleazar Wheelock, who I have reason to think from looking at archival sources was actually quite abusive of the students. I think it turns out that this first boarding school was very indicative of what was going to happen. We know he was beating the you-know-what out of them. I think there was worse stuff going on. But at this school, there were some Lenape students who even wrote letters to him. So we actually have statements from the colonial era, in English, not Lenape, but by Lenape students. And a few of these statements are even arguing with him. It's rare. Most of them are, oh, thank you, Professor Wheelock, for letting me come to your school. Oh, thank you. Okay. But some of the letters let some feelings out, and it's from reading those letters that I suspect some really horrible things were happening. But they've been printed. They're very accessible. It was printed a long time ago, you can guess, because the title of the book is The Letters of Eleazar Wheelock's Indians, as though he owned them. Okay. But again, this book was printed literally 80-some years ago. So there are these few sources that reveals the thought of a few Lenape people. And I looked uphill and down dale, and there really isn't much else in the archives of the colonial era by Lenape people. But I started to wonder, and this will not surprise most of you who live here and are used to the idea of large numbers of native people having come here and passed through in the history of Illinois. I started to wonder, okay, so they didn't write in the colonial era or before that, but could we perhaps find some writings from the post-Exodus period, after they were pushed out of New Jersey, when we're getting into the 1820s and 30s and they're here or even further on. And if there were some writings, were they perhaps any of them in Lenape, or were they all in English? Right? So I gave up on looking for stuff from the colonial period and thought, let's look a little later, but not the 20th century. I was still hoping to find things written by people who had at least grown up hearing and speaking Lenape, knowing their grandfather's old jokes, their grandmother's old religious practices, etc. And I did end up finding something. This is the place to look if you're doing Native American history. The Smithsonian, as you know, consists of many museums, and one of them is the National Museum of the American Indian, and they have in Suit, Maryland, an entire building full of mostly material culture of Native Americans that Native Americans have chosen to give into their care. This is very important. This is not stuff that was stolen from them in the 1800s. The Native American Museum, that is part of the Smithsonian, is a product of Native action. They came together, they planned this, they wanted it, they govern it, they are most of the staff people, etc. And they are collecting as much as they can from all 50 states of their people's history and culture so that it will be there forever. And as you can see, climate controlled and everything. Right? So in that place, they had the papers of a man named Mark Harrington, who was not native, who was a white boy actually from Michigan, and then he ends up in New Jersey in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He had a sad life himself. His siblings all died, and he had a stammer, so he had difficulty communicating. I think it made him more sensitive because he grew up really wanting to know more about indigenous peoples. He went to college, but decided getting a PhD was not for him, all this hoity-toity stuff. He just wanted to find work in the field. And he did find that there were anthropologists. This was the era, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when anthropology was in effect being invented. There was a famous man, Franz Boas, at Columbia, and he took a course with Franz Boas as an undergraduate. So in this moment, when anthropologists were running around, they get knocked for this now, but they were trying to collect as much as they could, artifacts, stories, etc. They get knocked because they're like, you shouldn't be salvaging something, you should be helping people stay alive. But in fairness to them, at that time, 100 years ago, they thought they were helping people stay alive. They meant well. So Mark Harrington gets hired by several of these anthropologists, and here he is actually in Cuba, meeting indigenous people. Now, the vast majority of indigenous people in the Caribbean were wiped out. If you learned that in your history classes, they did not lie to you. But the Spaniards, after every war against other rebellious indigenous people in Latin America, would often bring the prisoners of war and dump them in Puerto Rico or Cuba so that they'd be far from home and deracinated and unable to keep fighting. So there are indigenous communities to this day in Cuba and Puerto Rico, etc. So there he is, and he went around, again, being paid by these anthropologists, collecting various things. And he ends up going to Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Now this is actually, he was there in 1907, this is 1917, so it's a little too developed. I think you all know, if you saw the movie about the Osage, what was it called? Killers of the Flower Moon. So you tell me, what's going on in Oklahoma between 1907 and 1917? Why is this town like booming? They just found oil, right? Ironically, it was on Delaware land that they first found it in the Bartlesville area. Of course, they did not get to keep it. And it was not as much of a success story as it was for the Osage. As brutal as that period was, they did, as you know, get to keep many of the products, not so for the Delaware. In any event, Mark Harrington, gets sent out to Bartlesville by anthropologists to talk to the Delaware and other native peoples who are there. Because remember, it had very recently been given statehood, and it had been Indian territory. It wasn't just the Delaware who ended up there in the late 1800s, early 1900s. All sorts of tribes have been pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. We're finally told, okay, this is where you're going to be able to stay, Indian territory. Then it becomes the state of Oklahoma. So it's a good place to send Mark Harrington to buy various goods, etc. And I just wanted to give you some sense of the city, though, as I said, it would have been, this was boom time, so 10 years earlier, not so many houses, but it gives you the idea. Oh, too fast. Okay. Now, he did do what they asked. He bought many artifacts from people. This is a drum. It doesn't look like a drum, but it is a drum. It's made of dried deerskin, okay? But it does create sound in the same way that a drum does. And he bought this from the Delaware people, and it is now in a museum. Behind, one of those stuffy museums behind the glass with the fading background, okay? He was aware that there are moral issues. Not as aware as we are now, but he was then. And the reason I know he was aware is not that he didn't take the job, buy a lot of stuff, hand it over to the museum, but he wrote a story, a fictional story that he submitted to a magazine that was published. And in this story, a husband comes back, a native husband comes back, he has not been able to find, to successfully kill any game. He doesn't know what he's going to tell his wife, and she's sobbing. Why are you sobbing? Because there's nothing left in the garden, and I have nothing left to sell, she says. We've already sold all your grandmother's and grandfather's greatest treasures. The only thing we have left is with a one beaded robe that my aunt gave to me, and I don't want to sell it. And they decide to sell it. And then they have food for the 6 months. But he wouldn't have written that story showing the tragedy of it and the misery of this young woman if he weren't aware of it. So I don't know, but I am guessing that because of his guilt, feeling that his job was to go and sort of pay people to give up their heirlooms, that he was very interested in doing something more and actually collecting what was not a moral harm to collect, and that is their stories, their culture. He let it be known that he was very interested in talking to people who could still speak the Delaware language or the Lenape language. Yes, thank you very much. Here's the receipt for your drum and various other things, but yes, but is there anyone who still fluently speaks Delaware and who is willing to talk to me? Because actually, that's a key variable, because in the early 1900s, there were still many people alive who spoke Delaware. Now my co-author is one of the very few left. But, and everyone said to him, oh yes, there's Charlie Elk. it with the Delaware. The Delaware language. He tells the stories, he sings the songs just like they have for years. You gotta meet Charlie. So he went to, and he did meet Charlie Elcare, who spoke to him almost entirely in Delaware. And he met Charlie's wife, Susan Elcare. This is kind of fun. I show you the formal photo here, but in the museum I found the original photo that Mark Harrington took, with her helping, and she had carefully, this is a sheet, she had carefully taken a white sheet and used it to cover up what was actually, I think, a very nice parlor. She had a perfectly reasonable little parlor with wallpaper and a rocking chair and a fireplace. But she didn't want that, okay? Or maybe it was Mark Harrington, but she certainly was participating. It was her sheet, okay? And pinned it up, and then you can't see here because the published version of this has trimmed it like this, but she has the whole robe, and she's had her feet or various other things that I imagine she or her mother, her grandmother had made. So she was into presenting the sort of pure native woman vision instead of her real life and her real house. Okay? Mark Harrington also met several other people, including the man that he said actually helped explain the most to him because he was a fully bilingual guy, Julius Fouts, who was known to be Delaware or Lenape. In fact, looking at some of the records, I'm pretty sure he had one white grandfather, and that may be why he was so fluent in English. It's not clear to me, but he presented as he called himself, full blood. It was very important to him to present that way, and so he was a third person who helped a lot. So what's in the archive left over from all of these conversations that Mark Harrington had with these people? Much of what's there is Mark Harrington's notes in his little handwriting, and he'll ask questions and often not get the answer that he wants, and he'll say they said no, but I still think, okay, so it's very much a white man's voice, okay. There are also some publications like this, okay. He's hired an East Coast artist to, render Lenape culture, etc. I'm sort of fascinated by this because it looks a little bit like that rattle that has been found in the archaeological sites back in the East Coast, but again, we don't know much about it. So there's stuff that's really as much out of his brain and people and the brains of people he hired as it is out of Native Americans. But that's not all there is, okay? I'm not sure if you can read it from your stand, but this is March 20th, 1909. Dear Mr. Harrington, my dear friend, I thought I would send you a few lines of this story that there's no period. It should be, my boy got back from school and I told him to put it down. So there's a bit more of the letter, and then this was attached to a story in a young person's writing. And then keep going, and in the files you find quite a number of stories that the Lenape, have clearly dictated to their children, nieces, nephews, etc. Okay? When I say, or he says that my boy got back from school, he doesn't mean at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You all know what we're talking about, right? What the kid has come back from a boarding school for some sort of vacation, okay? So we have, in these files, stories that mostly Charlie Elcare and Julius Fouts dictated to the young people in their lives, and then they got mailed and end up in the museum. So I thought, wow, because now we have writings dictated, at least, if not in the handwriting of people who were speaking Lenape, who were elders, who remembered some of their former culture, etc. So I thought, we got to find out what the native peoples, the descendant communities want to do. I'm sure you've all, touched on this in various classes that you've taken. There's a whole new sort of spirit out there that did not exist when Ann and I were your age. Okay, it is now understood to be, as it of course always was, but it is now understood to be morally wrong. Okay, to simply, whether it's taking an object from Native people, but even a story. Okay. And write about it without their permission. So I went to Bartlesville and asked what did they want to do, and this was a fantastic experience because I had heard some horror stories that different factions of a tribe may want to do this or that, and the other faction of the tribe may not want to do that, and then you're the outsiders, you can't do anything, right? On the contrary, I had a fantastic experience. I met Nikki K. Michael, and this is the tribal headquarters in Bartlesville. she and another guy there made a very interesting point that at first I wasn't convinced by, but they turned out to be right. She said, we would probably like to publish these stories, but what we want to know is, was it definitely their idea, the Indian people's idea? Now, that letter that I had on the screen certainly implies it. He says, my dear friend, and I'm sending you this. This doesn't sound like someone who's operating, according to somebody else's values or desires. They wanted to know more, and their hunch was that it was definitely their ancestors' idea to get the anthropologist to write these stories down and now that was the part that I wasn't so sure about. I didn't think they were wrong. I just thought, could that be wishful thinking? It seemed so politically correct that it was the Indians in the driver's seat. Well, I went to Philadelphia. This is an aerial view of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, which is the place that Mark Harrington was working. These were where the anthropologists were who were paying him when he went out there. So I thought, I bet much of his correspondence and many of the artifacts have ended up in the Smithsonian for complicated reasons. But this was the place where I thought there might be correspondence. And indeed there was. There was a whole bunch. There we go, okay. Of letters to Harrington and from Harrington. And it was fascinating. He was the one who was trying to keep up with the Indians. Julius Fouts especially repeatedly wrote to him, like, you have the stories, why haven't you published the book yet? And at first I felt sorry for Harrington, because these letters were coming in like just a couple months after he got back. And the professors in the room will laugh. It takes more than a couple of months to write a book and publish it, right? So I thought, poor Harrington. But then, in fact, a couple of years went by, and he went back to Oklahoma. There were multiple visits, and he was often, telling Julius Fouts when he would next be there. They clearly had a real connection. Still, the book hadn't come out. Then I found out why. At one point, he says, I can't come. My wife is still sick. But he comes the following summer, I guess it was, and she died while he was out there. I mean, we forget this, but in the 1900s and 19-teens, that was, it wasn't of the flu, but there were other things that would come along. You get pneumonia as a young woman and you die. So he really had been having trouble with his wife who was dying, and so the book never got published. He was so distraught after her death that he quit the whole museum thing and went off and did something else. And those of you who are interested in Harrington, I can tell you more about him afterwards. But as a result, the project of publishing these Lenape stories, in a sense, died with his wife. So they sat there in the museum, and Julius Fouts didn't even have someone to write to anymore at the museum because Harrington had gone off. So there the stories were. Okay. I went over all of them carefully, of course, and so did Nikki K. Michael and other people on the Delaware Tribe of Indians Council. And it became very clear to me, and to us, I should say, there's no disagreement here, that the stories are very old. These were not just sort of things Charlie Elcare had heard in 1905 and thought was funny, so he mentioned it to Harrington and Harrington wrote it down. He really was telling traditional stories. So how do we know that? Why do I say that? Okay. To some extent, it's because we have evidence from missionaries, and you may think, huh, right? Well, beginning as early as the 1600s, first Dutch and then English missionaries, and so one Swedish guy, probably others, mentioned every time they would meet and kibitz with, talk to some Lenape Indians, oh, and then they told me a story about this, they told me a story about that. And we find, we don't get very clear versions of these stories. This is a 17th century missionary summarizing things. But we find that they're, in their own roundabout way, telling stories that sound a lot like those penciled stories that got sent by Charlie Elcare in the early 1900s. So example, this is a 19th century line drawing supposed to be of David Zeisberger, who was a Moravian, and of course in the 19th century vision of it, the Indians are all listening agog, but it does create a sense that missionaries and Indians would sit around fires and talk to each other in the early years. That was part of what happened. Right? One of the stories that got told in those settings and then gets written down in some garbled version by the missionaries has to do with the Turtle's Back. The book that I did with Nikki K. Michael is called On the Turtle's Back, as Ann said. Some of you may be aware of this because it's been taken up by modern Native activists So, we're all on Turtle Island is the saying that goes. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration because not all native groups shared this vision, but the Lenape and the Iroquois certainly did. The idea that the earth was, that the land on the earth, or at least the continent of the Americas, was metaphorically speaking, because they certainly spoke symbolically just as we do, on the back of a turtle. And they told a kind of an extraordinary story of divine beings who lived somewhere. It's not clear, deep in the earth, up in the sky, but not on land, earth with us. And then death came to them, and it seemed horrible, but there was always the, sort of the potential that their life could become richer because life just became shorter. But this young woman is, who's up there in with these divine beings, or down there, is struggling with her partner, her husband, and suffering because anger comes with death and fear comes with death. And eventually he pushes her, and she falls, or maybe the story says maybe she's coming up through the water. The idea is that it was supposed to be very deep and philosophical, and the missionary recording it at the time says they couldn't even make up their mind and tell me was she falling down or up, right? So he was just kind of missing the point. So she's going to fall, or she's coming up, and the animals decide to save her. Because the impact would have killed her, and they gather, they collect her, save her, and put her gently down. And then some of them are even braver, some of the water animals, and dive down to try to find some dirt so that she won't be just on a bare turtle back. And many of them die for this. The animals are giving their lives for the human, and they're not sure why they're doing it, but they are. And eventually there's enough sort of dirt and plants piled on the turtle's back that she's able to survive, and she has babies, and humans race emerges, and she does find that death, as horrible as it is, does create the possibility of heroism and greatness and love of life that is more intense than it would be if we didn't die. So it's a long story that is much more detailed, we now know, given the other versions that have survived and the missionaries are able to tell us. But the point is, some version of this was being told in the 1600s. Same story is being told in far away by very different people in the early 1900s. And there are other examples. This one, the classicists, and probably Anne in particular, will like, the story of Dido. So the missionaries loved the story of Aeneas. Please don't tell me if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Oh, classicists, okay, right? And they loved, I think he left Troy, and he goes to found, is it Rome? What does he found, right? So they liked the idea that they were, like Aeneas, setting out in the world, and they're going to found new, so they bring the Aeneid with them, and they're reading out loud from it in the firelight. And a little bit, it's actually only a couple of lines in the Aeneid, but was something that was very big in European culture. They clearly, these missionaries clearly elaborate on, is the idea that Aeneas and his Greek or Trojan fellow said, could we just, to Dido, a queen in a coastal town in the north of Africa where they had landed, they said to her, could we just have a little bit of land? All we want is a land that an ox hide would cover. So of course Dido and her people say, sure. But these Trojans, they were very clever, and they took the hide and they started cutting it around the edge, and in, and created a spiral of a sort of wire thin. So they were able to cover, surround a lot of land. Again, this was only a couple lines in the Aeneid, but it was an element that was sort of part of European culture, and clearly the missionaries mentioned this because that story appears not just among the Lenape, but among the Maya, down in Mexico, and several other groups. Every place where missionaries who had read this, the Aeneid, and told this story, often it's changed. Often it becomes a deer skin because they didn't have ox hides, etc. Okay? So this story likewise appears in one of the stories that Julius Fouts tells. Okay? So again, something that is being uttered in the early 1900s by this Lenape man, he clearly has gotten from people who came before, going back at least to the 1600s. The other evidence that these stories are very old, this isn't just something they heard in 1905, so I'm going to tell it to this silly white anthropologist because he wants something old, I'm going to tell him it's old. It really is old. Because there are these disparate points of production. So what I mean by that is, when you get, and someone who's like a medievalist or a real literary scholar will be able to explain this better than I, but when you get a story that's told here, so let's say in this part of France, in the 1200s, and maybe in another part of France in the 1300s, you get a very similar story. and there's no record of people passing back and forth between those places, literary scholars assume that there was some earlier version, okay, that was told and then spread to both of them. So you get disparate points of production, likewise in these stories. Here you have, for example, amongst the Nahuas, the people for whom I have lots and lots of records, the woman, the goddess, whose skirts can drown people when she shakes her skirts. Thunder rumbles and storms can come. I guess what they would, the word hurricane is actually an Arawak, a Caribbean word, but in effect it's like she's a goddess of hurricane. Okay? And in these Lenape stories that are still being told, when Harrington writes it down, there is the woman who shakes her skirts, who is carried off by a divine being and is unhappily married to a god, and eventually escapes and comes back to her people and says, but I can't stay because the gods are going to come and get me. I now have to live in this watery world. But I promise, every time they're going to unleash, the great torrents of rain on you, I will shake my skirts first. And when you hear the thunder, you'll know it's coming, and you can, batten down the things and do what you need to do. And there's no way that this man, Charlie Elcare, who, an old man in the early 1900s who had been, spent his childhood in Kansas. You remember that map, you can work your way backward. There's no way that he'd been chatting with Nahuas in Mexico or reading books where he might have read this. That was not a thing. Right? These had to be disparate points of production. So you also have a story that was told in the early 1900s, The Ball Player, and he's a great hero. His ball is the mandibles of a bobcat. And he's able to use this ferocious ball that's really the jaws of a bobcat to defeat his enemies. And you find that also in several different indigenous cultures, including the Nahuas, but also other upper Midwestern peoples, again, people that Charlie Elcare did not know. Whoops. But yes, okay. Some of it isn't so much disparate points of production as just themes in the story that make no sense when you think about it. The fact that he's telling the story in Oklahoma, that make a lot of sense when you think that his people originated in the Northeast. And here's, in effect, the title of the talk, The Bears and the Wild Pecans. His stories are full of bears, and there were no bears when he was growing up in Oklahoma. In the late, there may have been bears. One of you who studies evolution can tell me if they're paleontologists, but there were no bears then in the late 1800s, early 1900s in Oklahoma. But the stories are full of bears. And they're full of hunting, too, even though his people in the 100-year trek had been mostly farming. Right? But these are stories that are coming from what is now New Jersey, New York, which in olden times were full of bears, and where the people were hunters. Right? One of the best bear stories is connected to the pecans, so I'm going to combine both here. Okay? The best bear stories has to do with a little boy is orphaned, and he's being raised by his, I think, an aunt and uncle, who don't really want him. He was just kind of thrust on him, and they finally decide they're going to lose him in the woods. Okay? Maybe a little shocking to your sensibilities if you've been told that indigenous people are inherently kinder and better people. That's its own form of racism. So this aunt and uncle, they do not want this boy, and they leave him in the woods, and he ends up being raised by bears. In fact, for a while, even thinks he is a bear. At a certain point, hunters come and kill the bears that he lives with and take him home, and he's reunited with the human family. Not his own family, but with human beings. He re-enters human life. And you would think that the moral is, he's immediately going to realize, I need to tell people not to kill so many bears, because I know I know bears as individuals. But he doesn't. Instead, he uses his knowledge that he's gained by living with them to help human beings accompany them better. Now, the storytellers weren't happy about this, and they had in the story, the bears have a big meeting and decide, this has got to stop. We raised this kid, we give him life, we protect him, and now he's using this against us. And now here comes Monty Python, and again, the students will have to go search out Monty Python. So there are some very funny skits. So the bears hatch a plan, and I won't take you through all the details, but in effect, it has to do with ultimately chopping off the guy's arms and legs. But he doesn't die. How many of you have seen that scene in Monty Python where you pal have, where right, and finally there's nothing left with the body, but it's still talking? So I think they must have read this Lenape story, because that's in effect the name of the story. Okay. What struck me in particular as being very odd is that one of the things that the boy who's living with the bears does, one of the ways they live, is that they go out and they collect pecans, wild pecans to eat. Okay? Now pecans do grow in Oklahoma. So I had thought, well, here is one way in which the story does show that the storytellers are really telling stories about their own current lives, because there are no pecans growing wild then or now in New Jersey, like way too cold, right? Okay. So I thought, and then I looked into the language of it. Again, I'm really good with Nahuatl. I'm terrible with Lenape. I can say welcome and a few other things, but not much. So I had to really look into it. Well, it turns out the word pecan, where it actually comes from, is just the Lenape or the Algonquian language family, not just Lenape, but there are other Algonquian speakers. Word for nut. The Algonquian language, the root of sort of morpheme that means nut is pacan. And this entered English through trade with Indians on the East Coast. And then eventually the Santa Fe Trail brings actual pecans up from the warm customs up to St. Louis, and they enter the American market system. And people are like, oh, this is good. I mean, they figured out pecan pies pretty fast. What is it called? And then the Native Americans who were the traders, the intermediaries who were conducting the early Santa Fe Trail said pecan. Okay? So our word for pecan really is a misnomer. Okay? So when the people telling the story, when Charlie Elker and Julia Spouts were speaking in Delaware, through their children who were acting as translators to Mark Harrington, they undoubtedly were just saying pecans, nuts. Okay? We get it in the notes as pecan. They also they made a similar mistake. They always said the Indians when they meant the people, because their father or grandfather, Charlie Elker, was saying the Lenape, which just means the people. But they thought it meant the Lenape, the Indians. So we get funny versions of this in the translated iterations that Harrington is writing down. But it's certainly, these examples prove that these stories were very old. These were not sort of tall tales he had just heard in Oklahoma. So how is all this possible? We don't want to romanticize or essentialize Native Americans, say, oh, by magic, or just sort of in their own spiritual way, they had sort of kept these stories alive. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. But most of you, I'm guessing, if you were asked, like, what jokes and stories did your great-grandparents tell, would not be able to say much, right? Most of you know very little about that. There's a few exceptions, people whose families survived the Holocaust, or people who have, through a line of stories, talked about the ending of enslavement in this country. So there are families who still have family stories that go back to great-grandparents' time, but it's very, very rare. So, and I'm not one for saying that somehow natives are different, right? That they're different from all other human beings. So how is it possible? Well, I would say the answer probably goes back to Charlie Elker. I did, of course, as much research as I could in tribal roles, in censuses, etc. What am I showing you here? I think this is from the 1890s. I am coming in for the closing. Right. So he was a very old man in the early 1900s. Okay? He had been born about 1855. And we know this from historical documents. It could be 1854, it could be 1856. Okay. He was the son of a man named Mose Hapun, literally means hair of an elk. That's where Charlie got his last name, Elker, who was born around 1810. What that means, when you think about it, what that means, okay, is that he was born in the Ohio Territory, the Ohio Valley. Could have been in what they called Muncie Town in Indiana, could have been in the Springfield area here in Illinois. But he was born in the early 1800s at a time when the people were still very angry. They were, many of them, followers of Tecumseh. They had speakers of their own who were very much about retaining the old ways. These were people who were still hunting at least part of every year, definitely still speaking their own language, having very little contact with missionaries. And when you think about it, that little boy, say, who would have been born in the early 1800s, he would have been the child of people who'd grown up in the 1700s, right? Probably in western Pennsylvania, or possibly in Ohio. And at that point, they were still just living the life. I mean, still living their old traditional life, okay? So Charlie Elcare and his generation, but in this story, he's the key figure, were people who, although they're living in Oklahoma where there's roads and traffic lights, and you saw the picture of Bartlesville, had been born in the mid-1800s, before they had come to that world, when they were still in the Kansas Prairie, and were the children. His own father was someone who would have grown up literally in a world that still remembered very much the old ways, and was even still trying to enact them. So it makes sense suddenly that Julius Fouts and Charlie Elcare were pushing Harrington and pushing him. Here are some more stories, write them down. Why haven't you published it yet? Where's the book? They were aware that they were probably among the last people who would still remember everything, still get the old jokes, still be able to speak completely fluently, still understand the deeper meanings of the religious stories. And they were the ones who wanted it written down. So much for blaming those white anthropologists running around doing that. Okay? Native peoples themselves, at least in this case, were the ones saying, we don't have much time, kids, right? Okay? Because when I go, with me will go memories of what your people have been saying, believing, and doing for a long time. And they were not wrong. My co-author, Nikki K. Michael, is among the last. It lasted for another generation. This painting was done in the 1960s by the daughter of somebody who was a peer of Charlie Elcare. And this woman, the artist, she's still alive, but just barely. She painted this in the late 60s. Native American movement was really beginning. It didn't peak till 1973, but it was happening. And so she was interested in this, and she was asking her family all sorts of questions, and she was able to paint something which we had now found actually was real. We had now found in an old obscure museum where it had been sold, one of the last remaining costumes or outfits of the missing way, this spiritual leader doctor who used to run their fall religious ceremonies. So she was getting good information. Okay? It's conceivable in the 1960s that she had been taken to this obscure museum to see it, but not likely. And she certainly was known, Ruth Blalock was her name, for asking about it. So as of the 1960s, someone could still run around and ask Grandpa and Grandma and get the information. By now, she's in an old people's home and dying, and her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, they tell me they know none of this. Although I will tell you, that when I went out there after COVID ended in, would have been 2022, they had their first annual powwow. They had missed two, post-COVID end, first post-COVID, they had missed two. And I was watching, and they, eventually it becomes a big commercial thing, and all sorts of, white settler populations and other Indians are welcome, and they have, streamers and all sorts of things like you'd have at any other festival. But the first night, they very carefully do their traditional dances. And it's true that they now have to do handouts to tell people what the songs mean, because almost no one speaks Delaware. On the other hand, I saw these little girls trying to learn a dance, and it's a dance that I know from the archives. We have a written version that someone put down in the mid-1800s, so it's an old dance, and a mother has died, and she's asking her husband, can she have their son? Can she take him with her? And he's saying, no. He has to live his allotted days with me. Let him stay. And every time there's an interchange between them, the music stops. And that's part of the dance that everybody's supposed to know to freeze and stop. And the older people dancing, of course, all knew this. But the little children who were there too, and many of them had come from other states, et cetera. They don't all live there now because there's no jobs in Oklahoma, right? The little kids were like crashing into the people in front of them because they didn't know that the call and response, that when the music stops, everybody's supposed to smile. And my first thought was, oh, they're losing it, they don't know. And then I thought, no, these are 3 and 4 and 5-year-old girls. Next year, they'll know, right? And they'll stop. And that the dance at least will live. The stories, no. The stories they'll have to get from the book that Nikki K. Michael is trying to write and that I'm trying to help her with, etc. But in many ways, I think Charlie Elcare and Julius Fouts did get what they wanted. They have a permanent record now of some of the stuff that they wanted people to remember. So I'm sorry, I've gone a little bit over time, okay, but thank you. I told too many views from the story, but if any of you do want to stay for questions, you're more than welcome to. Others probably have to run because we're at the end of our hour. But I'm happy to take questions if anyone does. Okay. Oh, sorry, yes. Our class assist. You're going to correct me on the Aeneid.
In my world, there's a three-generation rule, which is that in oral cultures,
Yes.
Something that is not a part of daily life for 3 generations will leave orally passed down stories.
I absolutely agree. And when you think about it realistically, I mean, that's certainly what social scientists tell us and psychologists, but when you think about it in our own lives, we know our grandparents, mostly.
Yeah.
And we can tell stories about them, but beyond that, we really can't.
Right.
So when people say, oh yes, I really am a Shawnee Indian, and it's like our people have been passing this down from 1600 and we still remember.
Right.
They're the ones who aren't really Indians. Because the ones who are really Indians know that that's not true, that you have to struggle to remember this stuff, that it's work to do that. You have to ask the elders, it's constant. And you have to live together as a group and keep the language going. Otherwise, you've got a 3-generation rule, in fact.
So this does apply.
It does apply, absolutely.
So the bear stuff, like the bears being included in stories like that.
Well, I think that's what, so I guess you're helping me articulate better the thesis. What Charlie Elcare's family and people did in those generations clearly was make an extraordinary effort to keep telling those stories, to tell the kid purposely, I know you don't want to hear this, but sit down, we're going to tell the bear story again, or tell it in such a way that the kids would ask for the version again. And it's clear that they had made an extraordinary effort to do this, otherwise we wouldn't have such similar. Now, they're not memorizing it verbatim. This is not like an African griot where because we're not getting in the early 1900s exactly the same thing that you find in the missionary records in the 1600s. But startling threads of connection, which can only happen, it doesn't happen naturally. It can only happen if people are making an extraordinary effort. And it seems from the things that they said and wrote and did, that in that generation, the Lenape realized we're reaching the end of our ability to insist on this. The boarding school phenomenon had happened. Their own kids were being taken from them. Already people were leaving to get jobs elsewhere, etc. Okay? But up until then, they had managed. So yes, thank you for helping me clarify. Right? Okay. Others? I don't know anyone's name, so I think you were first, and then you were right.
Were there any efforts by the Lenape to rewrite the language?
Yes, in fact, Nikki K. Michael is a big part of that. So the last fully fluent speaker who learned at their parents' knee, so to speak, has died. But Nikki K. Michael and several others studied with that woman while she was still alive in the 1990s. And actually, COVID was good for something. She used to teach a class at the college where she works, and a few students took it. But under COVID, they started doing it remotely on Zoom, and so now you have Lenape people all over the country, even who have left to get jobs. And of course, it suddenly has become cool for the young people for the first time to actually study the language. So, and there's lots of things that have been written down post-Exodus, mostly 20th century. So they will be able to keep it alive in that way, but it's of course not the same as actual native speakers. That is gone for them. There are the Lakota, the Navajo, there are the Cherokee, there are a few groups of people who still have large enough groups that's really a vibrant, but mostly it's language revitalization, which is valuable because it will continue to render accessible the stuff that was preserved. But it's not the same. You're right to point that out. Yeah. Again, the handouts at their own powwows, they have to have handouts to tell them now what the songs are about. Yes.
He was criminal.
The same question, right. Okay. If Nikki were here, I think she'd give a different answer in that she's saying, yes, my online class is growing, we're going to do this. And so I don't mean to be disparaging, it's just that we all know that realistically, but you can keep it alive, but it's not the same as, right. There is one group is it the Hopi? I'll have to check. There is one group where they've like started a commune where they literally are only speaking that language so that those children will grow up, right? But that's a real dedication to say, we're gonna take our kids, we're gonna live here, and you're gonna speak it. I'll check who it is that's done that. And
Would you play?
it might be. Is that where it is? Yeah, I can't remember. I was impressed. I remember the concept more than the detail. The problem is, my guess would be that those kids will grow up speaking the language, but say, my kids are going to go to a suburban school and be normal. I mean, it's very hard to live in an island like that. And you pass the language on, but it's hard to make the kids enthusiastic about that. But, well, I don't know. Maybe it's going great. I hope so. But it's hard. You're fighting the tides of history then. Is that a, yes,
I noticed that where the Delaware were originally was very much a coastal, and there must have been a lot of estuaries and things.
yes.
So you would anticipate that perhaps a lot of stories and things would have those sorts of natural
Yes.
phenomenon in them.
And water snakes in particular, and I'm sorry, even though they're still in the title, I ended up cutting them because believe it or not, this was the shorter version, right? There just wasn't, so yes, water snakes are a huge part of their spiritual repertoire, sort of. And it used to be thought, well, that's because they live so near the creeks in Oklahoma. And it could be. But there's not a lot of other creek influence on their stories. And they're coming originally from, the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, in effect. That's a lot of water snakes. Okay? So I think that that's another example of, and it's interesting because sometimes the snakes are horrible, but mostly they're always dangerous, they're always powerful. But sometimes they're almost friendly forces, and that too goes way back in Native culture. Not snakes are frightening, of course, but there's something really wonderful about them too that isn't true in Western mythology, right? So that's more of a yes than a there are water snakes, and maybe you were asking more other influences of their water.
Well, I was wondering
aquatic environment.
if those sorts of things would fall out of stories quicker, because even though there might not be bears in Oklahoma, right, the kids would sort of still know what a bear was. Or what a snake was. But
right.
if you had a story about a clam, they might be going, what's
What?
that? And
You know,
instead of saying, let me tell you, you might just, let me switch that out. And maybe those switch outs would have a signal that you could pick up.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Like wampum, for example, which was made from the shells along the East Coast. It does still appear in the stories, but almost like a word for money. It's almost like they don't really get the shell quality, the beauty and the spiritual power of wampum originally. It's almost like it's become a word for money. So I think that might be an example of that. Okay? There was one story that really fascinated me that and I can't quite figure it out. It's about like a floating island. It's a ship where these horrible white people come from and do all sorts of damage. And in this story, Charlie Erko is the narrator. He gets to adjust things. At the end, these horrible white people are sorry, and peace is made. That he can't fix history, but what really struck me is, here he is, a couple hundred years from when they first dealt with men with blunderbusses on ships, still telling a story that is very much about that. But what I wish we could do is ask him, that's a ship, right? And that's a cat. And of course, that's not the question Harrington asked, so it's not in the notes, so we can't ask. But so I'm sure you're right, that there are examples of what you aptly call switch outs, right? Where things that no longer make sense have been adjusted, but yet the story as a whole is kind of still there, right? Yeah. Okay. Oh, yes, Petra.
Because you see like a, switch up to different cultures. Because the moment you say shells and money, it makes me think of West Africa, where it's currency.
Right.
So, did you also see elements where other groups' stories mixed in that
Yes.
absorb
Yes.
story elements that you can then trace to other native or beyond cultural contexts that they were touched on?
There are a couple of stories that they clearly must have learned in Kansas because they're Great Plains stories. They did go, while they were in Kansas, we do know from diaries and letters of white observers that some of the would go buffalo hunting. They learned, it was fun, they learned how to go buffalo hunting with other Indians. So I didn't get into that because there really was no time, but there are examples of more recent influence as opposed to stuff that would have come from long, long ago. And to some extent, it can't be fully teased out because, especially on the Great Plains, in the preceding 100 years, there had been a history of warfare, not just with white people, but amongst each other too. And so there were prisoner wives, children who were adopted from other cultures, and everyone was welcome to tell stories around the campfire. No one was treated like a second-class citizen. So some of it, you know, we'll never know, we'll never be able to piece together which came from which, because to some extent it was like almost a melting pot there on the Great Plains. Others, yes, no?
Joshua, do you have your hand up below?
No?
Sorry.
Yes,
So were there poetic meters within which these stories were told? Because I mean, that's, in the ancient world, that this is how things get remembered. Is that,
right.
you know, they fit into a meter, so we know that there's something that has, you know, certain magical quality that's got to be in this spot, so it's easier to remember.
So what Harrington was writing down is what the teenage children or Julius Fouts, the bilingual one, was telling him. So I've only got the English. There were a couple of other anthropologists who saw this stuff. Harrington came back and showed his notes back in the University of Pennsylvania. And then a couple of real anthropologists, meaning people with PhDs, right, quickly went out there with what did they used to call phonographs, you know, ways to tape things in effect. Okay? None of which survive, but at least their notes do, so there's a little bit of that. But it's very hard to tell what the rhythm is, what the beat is. And it'll take someone more talented and more sort of musically aware than I, and we probably don't have a large enough sample, but that must have been part of it.
It had to be.
It had to be,
Yeah.
right? We know for the Nahuas that it was, and we have lots of their stuff, but with no musical notation or beat notation at all. So all I've got there is the lyrics, but I mean, lyrics of songs that go on for pages and pages. There's no question that the beat had to be helping them remember. If it's an oral culture, the answer has to be yes, and yet I can't prove it, right? Yeah. So, oh, yes, hi.
So what made you want to start and like kind of continue doing this work?
Right, since my real life is studying the Nahuas, I just, in a breezy way, I said, because I'm living in New Jersey, but it was more concrete than that. It's a very good question. In 2016, Rutgers, where I teach, realizes their 250th anniversary, and they're the only public institution that was also a colonial college. I mean, it's usually the fancy schools that were around in the colonial, so they're like, we have a duty to talk about our heritage as a colonial college. And because it's a very public and left-leaning place, very diverse, that's like, and what that's going to mean for Rutgers is not like, oh, we're so old, we've been here 250 years. It's going to be, how are we involved in enslavement? And we had a very interesting dean who said, and how did we disenfranchise Native Americans? Which actually, a few other colonial colleges were grappling with enslavement. Georgetown in particular actually traced individuals, to people, they've traced it down to individuals who have been owned by and sold by Georgetown, and now their descendants are in Louisiana, still suffering poverty. Rutgers decided to do that, but add the piece about Native Americans. But then they had the problem that nobody on staff, nobody in the faculty was actually an expert on the Lenape. And that wasn't because they didn't care about Indians, it's because there are no sources about the Lenape. So really, the only people who have been studying them, when I say no, I'm being a little sarcastic, but have been archaeologists, okay, who were not in a position to tell them about the experience of being, what it felt like to be pushed out at that time. So they came to me and said, do something. And I said, I studied the Nahuas. And they said, well, you studied native languages, do something. So I actually worked with all the undergraduates that I taught that year. I said to them, they want this done now, I need help. And I was familiar with a little bit of what existed, which archaeological collections. I knew about these students who had been in Wheelock School. I knew that there were post-Exodus writings for other tribes. So I sent all these undergraduates off to do little bits and pieces. And you will see they are all mentioned in the book. And so, but that then got me started, and then I was off and running for the next few years, right? It's a great question. Are you an undergraduate?
Yes.
Yes, that's a great question. I thought that you're young for that question, to really think about what causes a project to be born and how does it happen and where does it go from there. That's great. Okay. Yes, David.
So our NEH grant was partly about figuring out what this place carries underneath our understanding.
Right.
And so you're talking about the Lenape, and they were here for 25 years or so. But we have these other peoples, the Tamaroa, the Sauk, other groups. How did they interact is a question I'm starting to think about. You know, how did they
In
affect
that
one another?
period,
Yeah.
it was rough. Actually, I talked about that a little bit with others today. I mean, it was worse in Missouri than it was in the Ohio Valley, because there was a more gradual approach in the Ohio Valley. I mean, they had been in Ohio for a long time. And a lot of other tribes were invited to the Treaty of Greenville so that they were aware of why the Delaware were showing up, right, as opposed to, oh, here they are crossing the river into our land, just how the Missouri Indians experienced it. But it was very stressful, and in the records of the various missionaries who commented on it, there are periods when they're all trying to get along well, because it is the era of Tecumseh, who is preaching pan-Indianism, but there are other periods where they are arguing and even fighting. And that is, I don't know, I find it very painful to talk about my undergraduates, but I think that's just part of history. People whose backs are to the wall turn first against those who love them. It's what we humans do. I mean, like the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto fought against each other before their uprising could happen. There are many instances of it. I think it makes sense. I mean, even in my family, when we're hungry and exhausted and dealing with some sort of family crisis, that's when I snap at my husband and he snaps at me. I don't know. We humans, when we're suffering, we turn on those who are right around us. It's not. So that did happen here as well. On the other hand, on the upside, at least in this story, I would say this was sort of the cradle or the place where the children like Mose Haku and Charlie Alca's father, where they left the East Coast. I mean, you don't think of this as the East Coast, but they did, right? This is the eastern woodlands, and now they're going west. That's how the Indians talked about it. It was when they crossed the Mississippi that they decided we've now left the eastern woodlands. So they thought of themselves as the generation that left the woodlands behind. I think it's not an accident that they were the ones who really made an effort. So something good happened on these lands that you're treading as well. Yes, okay.
Is there something equivalent to a Las Casas type of person in the US? Like a community of preachers?
Who was trying to do the right thing? Roger Williams came close. He was a Puritan, but he got thrown out by the Puritans. And one of the reasons he was thrown out is he said, Native peoples have some rights. So we went to Rhode Island and founded a colony there. I mean, in the end, the Rhode Island, like the Narragansetts, the Indians of Rhode Island also ended up suffering despite, but so did people who worked with Las Casas. They couldn't really stop the tidal wave. But so yes, there was someone who tried. I think if we look hard enough, even in the worst of times, there's always some human who is trying to stand up to power, which is part of why it's so upsetting. I don't think you hear this so much anymore, but in our era, the faculty in the room, we heard a lot of, well, you can't judge people because they didn't, for doing these horrible things, because they really didn't know, and like everybody was, enslaving other people. But when you look hard, there's always someone. I mean, in the U.S. South, there were two girls who had no power, the Grimke sisters, who said, this is not okay, we're going to run out of here and leave and write stories about it. There were only two white women who did that in the whole U.S. South, but they did exist. So I think you can usually find someone, and I'll think if there are others besides Roger Williams, and then I'll tell Professor May-Mary, but yes. Okay. Is that another undergraduate? That was a great question too. Yes, go ahead.
You spoke a lot about or at least you showed the graph of the movement of the Lenape people from what was New Amsterdam all the way out until Oklahoma.
Right.
And somebody who loves like military history like myself, I pay attention to the years, and I'm thinking immediately of conflicts and wars. How did the relationship between the Lenape people and the U.S. government, how was that? Because the time periods in which they're moving are sparked with conflict.
Absolutely. And over, actually, the Delaware Lenape play a key role. They are involved in the whole fiasco that George Washington was involved in that helped get started the French and Indian War. In the American Revolution, the Lenape were promised by the Continental Congress in the first Indian Treaty that if they stayed neutral, there would be a 14th state. After the 13 colonies, it would be an Indian state, and they could even invite other native peoples to live there with them, and they were like, okay, that's a good deal. The the chief who signed the treaty and knew about it was later killed. Now, he was killed by other Indians, but those other Indians were allied to the Americans. So an American Army lieutenant said he was sure it was done on purpose. He actually wrote a very public, angry letter about this. Like you, George Washington, you had White Eyes killed so that he wouldn't tell everybody at the end of the Revolution, you know, you guys, you owe us a 14th state. Okay? So then when they were out after the Treaty of Greenville, it was a lot of the negotiations about whether or not they would be pushed out of the Ohio Territory Ohio Valley took place during the time of the War of 1812, when the American government was still worried about whether these Indians would still side with the British up in Canada. And then they get pulled into the Civil War, and they're in Kansas. So over and over and over, they get pulled into America's fights, right? And sometimes try to make use of it, like when they thought they could get their 14th state out of it, but were lied to. I think it's 4 out of 5 of the able-bodied men between 18 and 45 of the Delaware de Lenape actually joined the Union Army. They thought of themselves as people who had come from the North, and they were very against slavery. There's old records, even when they were in Pennsylvania and Ohio, them complaining about the existence of slavery. So it could have been for that. It's also, I mean, the cynical part of me thinks it was a good paycheck. So they might have been too motivated. It also allowed them to be a warrior again and ride across the prairies and be honored for it, instead of people saying, there's a dangerous Indian man. Right? So I'm sure they had multiple reasons for it, but they were very brave, and many of them died in the Civil War. I mean, the high casualty rate of that war. But it's a great question. I'm not used to getting a bunch of great undergraduate questions. Yeah, hi.
I'm not an undergraduate.
Right, I was going to say, you're not an undergraduate.
My question might not be that great, but I'm thinking about, just thinking about the function and the meaning of the stories themselves, right? So we've discussed a little bit about the kind of the narrative content and so on and so forth. And I'm really fascinated by somebody like Charlie Elker, who's kind of sort of standing as you positioned him between shifting worlds, you know.
When you think of when he was born and where he was, I
right,
really
right.
was,
So this kind of, an entire worldview was really in transformation into something else, and he's kind of standing in this medium point. And I wonder if there's any, I mean, maybe this is thinking a little bit too detailed, but if there were any commentary or anything that he gave on the ways in which the stories that, seem to exist somewhere between metaphorics and metaphysics, the meaning, the function of those stories was shifting, or was
he did not talk about it, right?
I assume that would be a little bit
right.
too...
I mean, maybe he could have if Harrington had asked. He disagreed with Harrington in Harrington's own notes, when Harrington would try to get him to say, does this mean that? And Harrington would have some silly sort of essentialist, no, okay? Or like, well, how did they know that it was time for the fall gathering? Like, because it was time, right? So he had very little patience for the sort of stupid questions, but beyond that, we don't get sort of his analysis. And so that was something that Nikki K. Michael and I were struggling to do in writing little introductions for each story, because that would be my guess about why nothing had, because these papers have been in that museum for a long time now. And I would guess that the reason more hasn't been done is when you first read them without context, without knowing who the tellers were, or who Harrington was, or anything else about other tribal stories. I think it helped me a lot that I had studied other tribal stories. You do think like, okay, she's shaking her skirts and is not, then they won't die in the rain, and what do I do with that, right? But then when you find that there are all these women shaking skirts in all sorts of native stories, and you think about the danger of hurricanes, and you look at that in other native stories, suddenly it starts to make sense. And you can think of it as not necessarily literal, but metaphysical, as you say. But we're left doing that, sort of extrapolating, gathering stuff from context, from other native stories, from other things Lenape said elsewhere, from our own knowledge of the missionaries, because he didn't say it, right? Which is part of the tragedy. Even when we get close to hearing native voices, as we do in these stories, it's not as much as we would wish for. And now, when people are finally getting it and asking questions, and native people are being given mics to tell, they themselves say, we don't know what our great-great-great-great-grandfather was thinking. So it's sort of tragic. If only we could have gotten Charlie Elcare on tape, not only telling the stories, but talking about them. Because he clearly would have known there are multiple ways to understand any one of these stories. And that's one thing, it's very clear, I mean, with our sensibilities now, reading it, it's very clear that they're not, it's true art. At no point are they saying, they sort of didactically saying, therefore, you should all do this for the rest of your life. They're showing that life is complicated and that you're going to have to deal with these various issues, and you'll have to figure out how. Okay? Even at the end of the ball player one, the one with the ball, he does eventually, his brother's wife has been taken away in war, and he does save her and everything, and then the villain, the nasty other tribe, they defeat them, and they've got a bunch of other wives who don't want to be there and want to go home, and those other wives say, won't you take us home? And in a Western story, they're like, sure, I'll take all the pretty babes, you can all come, I'll free you all, right, okay. And they're like, no, we came to get our sister, we don't need, our sister-in-law, we don't even know where you live, you're gonna have to walk, find your own people, because you're you and we're me. And the point of the story wasn't like, don't ever save somebody else's wife or anything like that. It was just like, you're each going to have to find your own path, and they're letting the listeners decide what they want to do with that. Okay? They're more complex in that sense than sort of classic Western stories or movies. They don't have the ending of the movie that we're expecting. But I'm extrapolating, I'm looking at context, I'm looking at I don't have Charlie Elcare showing me that that's the case. But I guess if you're a literary person, I guess I don't have to convince you that the stories themselves are some of the evidence, right? Yes, Dante?
You mentioned, I guess Professor Mayberry mentioned earlier that as an undergrad you were a women's studies major.
Yes.
And, later going into this. How do you see that with the, kind of the gender relations within specifically within these Native stories?
The stories, yes, it's very interesting. I didn't have time to bring that up at all. But a couple of the storytellers were women. Not only Susan Elcare, but Julius Fouts' wife, Minnie, was really into traditional, especially dancing and singing. But she told some stories too. And interestingly to me, the stories that the women told all had, without exception, had something to do with death, and often with feeding the dead. And in fact, I learned from my visits out there that even today, that is one of the women's many jobs, like not only feeding the dead symbolically or metaphorically, but feeding everyone who comes to the funeral very, very literally, which is connected to the old out of the dead. So it seemed almost like, again, I don't have this in their words, but given that that's what all their stories were about, and they didn't seem to interfere with or tell these other kinds of, it's almost like their world had said, this is your arena, remembering the dead, talking to us about the dead, symbolically talking to them, feeding the dead, feeding our memories of the dead, because that's how you stay alive, by being remembered by those who loved you. That's women's work, and those are the stories you will tell, and they did. Okay? So there's definitely good gender analysis that could be done, much more so than we did in the introduction. And Nikki K. Michael is big on this. She's something of a, shall we say, feminist? I think she would use that word, right? And feels very strongly that women's roles show in the stories. Well, like even the women that are being rescued from captivity, they're like, they're helping the guy who has come to kill this evil man, evil group of men who kidnapped them. So it's not your classic, of course these are changing now in your world too, but it's not, this is not a girl screaming as being dragged along while Batman does everything. Okay. Okay. Shall we say goodnight? Thank you for staying so long. I really appreciate it.